Welcome to Israel Now News. I'm Yochanan El-Rom.
And I'm Erin Viner.
In our top story, Arabs celebrate as Jews mourn. Israel was rocked by a wave of terror attacks that claimed the lives of 2 soldiers and a newborn baby and left 14 people wounded. The Palestinian Authority issued a half-hearted statement of condemnation, but later joined Hamas in praising the attacks. The Fatah party of PA leader Mahmoud Abbas boasted that Israel cannot protect all of its soldiers and citizens. The Hamas terror group called for continued bloodshed. Israeli security forces conducted operations in Arab villages, eliminating several terrorists and arresting dozens of others connected to the murderous attacks.
Australia faced heavy criticism from its neighbors, Malaysia and Indonesia, after it recognized a part of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. In a surprising move, the foreign minister of Bahrain stood up for Australia against the Arab League, saying that recognition of West Jerusalem in no way hampers Arab demands nor contradicts the Saudi peace initiative. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said that he believes the declaration that Western Jerusalem as the Israeli capital will advance peace negotiations. Canberra is set to establish a defense and trade office in Jerusalem immediately and will also begin scouting sites for the future Australian embassy.
The IDF has uncovered a 4th terror tunnel along the border with Lebanon. The Israeli army commenced Operation Northern Shield in a mission to locate and destroy a series of subterranean passageways built by Hezbollah, Iran's proxy army. These underground attack routes reach into Israeli territory and pose a serious threat to Israel's security. A military source said they believe the tunnels were meant to be used to launch a surprise attack in which hundreds of Hezbollah operatives would invade Israel from below as the terrorist organization simultaneously unleashed a massive barrage of rockets, missiles, and mortar shells at the Jewish state from above ground.
In response to Airbnb's anti-Semitic boycott of listings in Judea and Samaria, 2 Jewish entrepreneurs have created an Israel-based home renting service to offer properties in all of Israel. The website is called Ole Stay. It was designed by Noam Beltran and Joseph Sokol, who say that they're on a mission to become the alternative Airbnb in Israel and eventually around the world. The Airbnb decision to give in to the campaign against Israel sparked a wave of public calls to boycott the online marketplace, and the issue even landed in court. The company has been held in breach of contract by the town of Surfside, Florida, for discriminatory policies against Jews in Judea and Samaria. And dozens of Israelis have filed a class action lawsuit in Jerusalem against Airbnb.
The Deputy Prime Minister of Italy was in Jerusalem recently, where he spoke out against the European Union's unfair treatment of Israel. Matteo Salvini said the EU has been entirely unbalanced as it condemned and sanctioned Israel at every opportunity. Salvini met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as Public Security Minister Gilad Erdan, to discuss ways to counter anti-Israel decisions at the United Nations and in the European Union. The Italian political leader stressed that whoever wants peace in the region needs to support Israel.
The series of violent demonstrations in France have now taken on an anti-Semitic narrative. Many in the Yellow Vest protest movement have begun to scapegoat the Jewish people for the country's social and economic hardships and even accuse French President Emmanuel Macron of being a Jewish pawn. Thousands of rioters marched through the streets of Paris carrying anti-Semitic posters and making Nazi salutes. Jewish institutions throughout France were put on high alert, and several synagogues were forced to close for security reasons after a series of threats were received. Community leaders are expressing fear for their safety, and a record number of French Jews have made inquiries about immigrating to Israel.
The anti-Semitic boycott, divest, and sanction Israel movement has been declared illegal in all cities in Chile. This comes after the town of Valdivia issued a call to expel the Israeli ambassador, falsely accusing the Jewish state of ethnic cleansing and declaring itself to be the first municipality in Latin America to be free of Israeli apartheid. Well, that's when Chile's national comptroller got involved. After examining the case, he ruled that Chilean law prohibits arbitrary discrimination based on considerations such as nationality. He said municipalities do have some degree of independence, but they do not have the legal authority to conduct relations with foreign powers. His decision means that BDS is illegal in all cities in the South American country.
An Arab man testified to the Israeli Knesset about his torture and abuse at the hands of the Palestinian Authority. The witness, identified only by the first name of Walid, said that he was arrested and imprisoned by the PA after being accused of informing Israel about terror attacks. He told a special Knesset committee that he was sentenced to death for preventing bloodshed because he wanted peace and not terror. The Israeli lawmakers expressed outrage that human rights organizations have turned a blind eye to the plight of Palestinians being detained and tortured for the so-called crime of collaborating with the Jews, and they're calling on the world to hold the PA accountable for abusive actions against the PA's own people. The death toll of the massacre at the Strasbourg, France Christmas market has now risen to 5. 13 other victims were wounded when an ISIS-affiliated terrorist is reported to have shouted, "God is great," in Arabic before opening fire on the holidaymakers. The Muslim gunman was later killed by French authorities following a nationwide manhunt. The Islamic State terror group claimed responsibility for the attack, and the terrorist's father has confirmed that his son was an ISIS sympathizer.
A U.S. State Department advisor has exposed 5 countries that have failed to return artwork stolen by the Nazis. Italy, Russia, Hungary, Poland, and Spain have been accused of failing to fulfill the Washington Principles Treaty, which demands that they make their best efforts to return items plundered by the Nazis during the Holocaust. Stuart Eisenstadt called out the 5 nations, saying that they have not done enough to return the looted property and in some cases have even privatized the stolen art.
More than 100 people have been arrested in a ruthless crackdown on Christianity in Iran. The Islamic Republic has issued a fatwa against conversion out of Islam and has increasingly targeted the Christian sector. Human rights organizations criticize the rogue state for abusing members of the minority faith, who make up less than 1% of the population. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly tried to draw international attention to the plight of Iranian Christians, who he says are the victims of a brutal campaign of persecution.
Sarah Netanyahu, the wife of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was in Guatemala on a mission to launch a new health campaign in the Latin American nation. The Jerusalem Project, spearheaded by the Jewish community in Guatemala, will provide aid, medications, and life-saving medical treatments to millions of Guatemalan children. And in a related development, Israel donated 270 wheelchairs to disabled children in Guatemala. The Wheelchairs of Hope program, sponsored in part by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs Mashav Agency for International Development, has provided thousands of wheelchairs to children in developing countries worldwide. They are now working on the second phase of the Guatemalan project, which is to provide colorful, lightweight wheelchairs to older children, as well as specially designed wheelchairs for children with complex disabilities.
The Israeli embassy in South Africa has assisted in the renovation of a community center in Soweto, just outside of Johannesburg. Unfortunately, the project attracted some negative publicity when activists of the anti-Israel BDS movement labeled the goodwill gesture a public relations stunt financed by the so-called apartheid state in the Middle East. Local leaders were nevertheless quite happy for the helping hand extended by Israel's ambassador to South Africa. Members of both nations worked together to repair the rooftop of the community center, and it was able to reopen. An Israeli official praised the cooperative effort and said that the hall plays an integral part in the lives of more than 400 children living in the area.
Archaeologists in the holy city of Jerusalem have recently unearthed a biblical half shekel mentioned in the book of Exodus. In 1999, the Muslim Waqf, which controls the Temple Mount, illegally dug up and dumped thousands of years of Jewish history. The mounds of dirt were taken to Emek Tzurim, where archaeologists and volunteers have painstakingly sifted through the rubble, uncovering precious artifacts from Jewish antiquity. The Temple Mount Sifting Project has expanded its search to dirt taken from other excavations, such as the 2013 dig under Robinson's Arch. It is from this particular mound that a volunteer recently discovered a biblical weight. Israeli archaeologists believe that this 3,000-year-old stone was used in the First Temple period by pilgrims paying their half-shekel tax before ascending the Temple Mount. Doron Spielman, the vice president of the City of David Foundation, said this weight, inscribed with ancient Hebrew, is once again anchoring the deep historical connection of the Jewish people to Jerusalem. He said the discovery is a reminder from our ancestors in the First Temple times that the State of Israel rests upon a foundation that began more than 3 millennia ago.
In a wonderful display of support for the Jewish state, the African nation of Zambia has launched a pro-Israel caucus in its government. The chairman of the newly formed Zambian Parliamentary Israel Allies Caucus said that the establishment demonstrates the importance his nation places on its relationship with the Jewish state. Josh Reinstein, the president of the Israel Allies Foundation, said, "We are thrilled that the Zambian Israel Allies Parliamentary Caucus now joins together with 38 other Israel Allies caucuses around the world in supporting Israel at a parliamentary level through faith-based diplomacy." This movement is having a major effect in Africa, and we will soon see several African countries move their embassies to Jerusalem. Reinstein said that Christians are uniting around the cause for Israel all over the world.
The city of Jerusalem is decorated and ready to celebrate the Christmas holiday. In an effort to make the season festive for the city's Christian residents, the Jerusalem municipality distributed free Christmas trees and decorated the Christian quarter of the Old City with lights, garland, and ribbon. We at Israel Now News would like to wish all of our Christian viewers a very Merry Christmas.
And a very happy, healthy, and prosperous New Year. That concludes the news portion of our show. Stay tuned for Ask the Source with Josh Reinstein.
Hello and welcome to Ask the Source. I'm your host, Josh Reinstein, and we're here on a beautiful sunny day on our rooftop studio in Jerusalem. My guest today is Dr. Charlotte Phillips. She is the head of Glory Center Ministry International. Dr. Phillips, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Josh.
Tell our viewers a little about what is Glory Center Ministry International.
Well, Glory Center Ministries International is what we call an apostolic and prophetic training center, and we're hubbed in Baltimore, Maryland, just outside of the Washington, D.C. Region. So we kind of man that whole gate, we'd like to say, for the Lord and the Lord's purposes. And Baltimore, of course, is very central to Jewish identity in America, in the United States. It has the 3rd largest concentration of Jews in the country. So we're right where the action is, between Washington and Baltimore.
You're here in Israel, you're a Christian leader, you stand with the State of Israel. Why should Christians in today's age stand with the State of Israel?
Oh, it's so important. Even from the New Testament perspective, Old Testament perspective, our Bible is very clear. The rooting of everything that deals with the kingdom of God is central to who Israel is, the State of Israel, and the Jewish people. So it's very important, covenantly, as a believer, as a Christian, that we stand with Israel and show our love and support however the Lord is leading us, and that's why we're here.
You know, the Jews and Christians believe in what's you call the Old Testament, and a lot of African American churches actually read the Old Testament more than any other church, yet we find that in the African American community sometimes they're not so pro-Israel. Where's the divergence there?
Well, we're not sure on every front. We know that there is a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of teaching, a lot of psalms, hymns, all of these things on the spiritual side, but the depth of understanding doesn't seem to be there about really who Israel is and why she is significant, especially in these last days. So one of the things that we're targeting is to try to create opportunities not only for African American leaders to come to Israel and experience what's happening here and to see the land, see the people, but to also study here. It's very important not to just come and do the tourism, but it's important as a Bible teacher to come and really understand, what does the Torah say? What is the biblical foundation that we're standing on when we use this word Christianity?
One of the things that bind the African American community and the children of Israel is our horrible past in slavery. Yes. And the fact that God brought us out of slavery into freedom. Do you think that's a uniting issue that will bring Jews and African Americans together?
It's an unbreakable bond, and a lot of us don't understand that our Bible even begins in Adenic Africa. The first 2 nations that are mentioned in our Bible are Hezbollah and Ethiopia. And so there's some kind of connection here with the African American community needs to understand that it goes back even before before this, the transatlantic slave trade and all of that. This is something spiritual. There's something about the reality of the Jewish people, this land, and people universal. I mean, every nation, kindred, tribe, and tongue is called to worship here, is called to know the one true God of Israel. And I think it's very important and very significant that our African American brothers and sisters, clergy, whomever, really grab a hold of Israel and the revelation of the Jewish people in these last days.
You mentioned Ethiopia, and of course Israel's the only country to ever take a people out of slavery in Africa and bring them into freedom. We have now 130,000 Ethiopian Israelis here, Jews, proud Jews from Ethiopia. How much of an effect does that community have when making a bridge between Israel and the African American community?
Well, that's one of the reasons why we're here. We actually have done some work in Ethiopia, and we're actually continuing to do some work all over the continent of Africa. And one of the goals that we have for our project, Bringing Up the Tribes, which is actually the component of GCMI, Glory Center Ministries International, that is kind of working through this Support Israel and Standing with Israel dynamic. But in Bringing Up the Tribes, we have so many leaders within our circle of influence in Africa who are longing, they have waited their whole life to connect with Israel and the God of Israel. And we feel a responsibility, not just out of the House of Color in America, but also on the African side, to build bridges of reconciliation and support.
Tell us a little bit about what is Bringing Up the Tribe, because you mentioned it several times. It sounds like an exciting development.
Glad you asked. It's commissioned out of Psalm 122, verse 4, where the Lord commands the tribes to go up, where the tribes go up. It's that beautiful psalm that David began with, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. My feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. So here we know, here is the city of our God, here is where the tribes, every nation, kindred, tribe, and tongue in the house of God shall come up. And so that's kind of where we take our commission from Psalm 122, verse 4. And then also following that, if we look at Isaiah 56 and 7, my house should be called a house of prayer for everybody, for all nations. And so it's very important that whatever is missing some kind of way has got to become a part of what's happening here so that this holy altar can be fulfilled right here in Israel.
You know, like President Trump or not, there's no denying he is the most pro-Israel president we ever have, and a lot of that credit goes to the Bible-believing Christian community in America.
Absolutely.
How much of an impact are Bible-believing Christians having in relations between the United States and Israel today?
I believe it's imperative. I believe that a lot of people haven't understood Mr. Trump and the commission and why he's in position at this hour. Certainly a friend of Israel, whole family, a friend of Israel, and we've been watching the Prime Minister here and the relationship develop. I believe that the support and the intercession, the prayers, the laboring in the spirit that's going on Israel's behalf is being driven by the evangelical community. And so it's an imperative component of what's happening. It's a spiritual dynamic that's happening, and it's birthing something brand new for this generation.
Your ministry focuses a lot on prayer. How important it is for Christians to pray for the peace of Jerusalem?
It's important because it's a mandate out of the scriptures. It's a mandate that we not be silent. You know, Dr. Martin Luther King said something that was very significant. He said, if we won't learn to dwell together as brothers, we're going to perish together as fools. And he's saying to us that whether we understand, whether we don't understand, we all have a mandate to become one, to do this, what this Hebrew word echad means. Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God. And so the providence that is spoken from this place that touches every other nation, whether it's America, whether it's South America, whether it's Europe, Africa, Asia, there's a rallying point here that we all need to step into and embrace because it is the command of the scriptures of Almighty God.
Dr. Phillips, there are literally tens of millions of people watching this show. What message do you have for our viewing audience?
Wow. Come, experience, see, pray, stand, support, shoulder to shoulder with our brothers here in Israel and the Jewish people.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips, for being on the show, and thank you for tuning in to Ask the Source. I'm your host, Josh Reinstein, wishing you a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Now back to the studio.
Up next, the return to Zion with Karen Hayesod.
Shalom and welcome to the Return to Zion with Keren Hayesod. I'm Greg Maisel, the Director General of Keren Hayesod United Israel Appeal, the leading official fundraising organization for the State of Israel. Aryeh Oz is one of Israel's most famed pilots and was responsible for helping to bring home our brothers and sisters from Ethiopia. Let his story inspire you to help bring home the next generation of Ethiopian Olim.
I was born in Germany. My family fled Germany after the Kristallnacht to Holland with an intention to immigrate to Palestine. However, the Germans conquered Holland and we were stuck in Holland. It was 1942 when we were summoned to the German headquarters and told that we have to evacuate our home to an extermination camp in Poland. A student came over and said, "We have a hiding place for you." The next day I found myself in a Dutch farming family. They kept me for 3 years. I immigrated into Israel in 1946. I was almost 11 years old. I was completely alone in this world. Wherever I came, somebody or some institute came to my rescue. The biggest of all was a youth village where I came to. The educational management took me by the hand and guided me and gave me a start which made my way up to flying school a piece of cake. I was selected by the Air Force to become a cadet in the most famous Israeli Air Force. I was grateful that I could repay in a small way and contribute to the same effort. This mutual responsibility, from which I gained so much, followed through my whole career in the Air Force. I was the third captain who flew a C-130, a Hercules, to Entebbe and rescued so and so many people. When we were told that we have to fly 4 airplanes to Entebbe at weights beyond any imagination, we didn't ask any question. We said, it is needed, it will be done. In the early 90s, we were about to evacuate 14,500 Ethiopian Jews from Addis Ababa to Tel Aviv. We had 760 seats in our aircraft. However, when they arrived and all the seats were occupied, commanding officer of the operation came over and said, "We need you to take more people on." And my answer was, you don't have to ask even. It's obvious, bring them on. I set the world record. I brought on one flight 1,087 people from Addis Ababa to Ben Gurion Airport. When we descended and came over Jerusalem and made a left turn towards Ben Gurion, and the whole oil aircraft was singing Yerushalayim of gold, there was not one person in the cockpit who had no tears in his eyes. Every time that when I made my walk around, I always looked up and saw the Star of David and said to myself, gee, this is Israel. This is the Jewish people.
Join Keren Hayesod in celebrating Israel's 70th anniversary by donating only $70 a month to help fund Aliyah. Let's bless Israel together.
To donate and get information, call us at 1-800-505-1665 or visit our website at www.khisrael.org.
Sanctions reimposed by the Trump administration on Iran on November 5th are a godsend to the state of Israel, to the Middle East, and the world. Understand that under the Iran nuclear deal, the vicious Iranian regime received tens upon tens of billions of dollars in sanctions relief. Now, that money was designed to moderate the Iranian regime, but just the opposite happened. The Iranian regime used that money to conquer large swaths of the Middle East, from Iraq, from Yemen, across Syria into Lebanon. It used that money to kill hundreds of thousands of people in our region. It used that money to build intercontinental ballistic missiles whose only purpose is to carry nuclear warheads. It used it to advance centrifuges that can enrich uranium at 4 times the rate, so that when the nuclear deal expires in another 7 years, Iran can create not one, but hundreds of nuclear weapons. And that money was used to threaten Israel with destruction. What can be a worse deal? What could be a more vicious and destructive deal? And so Israel was deeply grateful for the actions of President Trump in reimposing sanctions and actually ratcheting up the sanctions that had existed under the Obama administration. These sanctions are harder on Iran. The idea will be to bring Iran literally to its knees, to the table, if it wants to renegotiate an agreement. But the conditions sent by the administration that Iran must cease all support for terror. It must get out of Syria and Lebanon. It must stop threatening Israel with destruction. These are essential conditions which we strongly support here in Israel. The sanctions are a great boon to America's security, but not only to America's security, to our region, to our state, and to the entire world. And for that, the entire world, rather than opposing the sanctions, should always be deeply grateful.
That's all for this edition of Israel Now News. I'm Yochanan El-Rom.
And I'm Erin Viner, reporting from our studio in Jerusalem. Please join us again next week for all of your Israel updates.